As a follow-on to the previous videos that I did on Was Peter in Rome, I'd like to speak about John Mark. We mentioned John Mark in those videos, but today I want to focus on John Mark and his accomplishments and what he has done. For one thing, John Mark had many titles at this time, but if I were giving him a title, I'd call him the Amazing One, because he was an amazing young man who grew up in the faith and then was quite remarkable in what he has accomplished. I want to admit that much of what I'm going to say today came from the Coptic Church. The what? The Coptic Church. It's the church that's founded in Alexandria. There was the see at Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. Coptic refers to an Egyptian language which supposedly is related to the pharaohs, and the Coptic Church still is in existence today, and that's where this material came from. Their pope is named Tawadros II, and believe it or not, he is the 118th pope that they can identify, tied up all the way back to what they call the Apostle Mark. Now that's quite an accomplishment, and it doesn't have near the history that the Roman Catholic Church does in trying to tie their existing pope back to Peter. So, in spite of the persecution by Rome and the Muslims, they maintained an unbroken history, and at one point their methodology was that they went away to a monastery, and they lived a monasterial type of life where they just had to get away from all of the aggression and the hate that was thrown at them. So anyway, now to me, their history has more validity than the Roman Catholic history, because I see in the Roman Catholic history a tendency to preserve tradition at all costs. And I mentioned in that video last week that Jerome was admittedly a liar. The Catholic Church admitted that he lied about what he had written. Now I'm using the material from the Coptic Church in this presentation, and I'm happy to do that. This is going to be a quick summary of the life of John Mark. Mark was a native of North Africa. It's where he was born. Today, the country is Libya. He was born in the city of Cyrene, you'll see on that map, and in Cyrene, it was a part of the Pentapolis. Pentapolis are the 5 large cities in that area. So, the Pentapolis, west of the border of Egypt. So, the Coptic material says that Mark was born of Jewish parents several years after the birth of Jesus. I think his mother was Jewish, with the name Miriam, but his father had a Greek name, and that makes me suspicious. His father's name was Aristobulus. Aristobulus is a Greek name, but he could have, like the Coptic people say, he could have been a Jew. I don't know. His original name, John Mark's original name, was John Yochanan, which is Jewish. And his second name, or his surname, was Mark, Marcus, which is Greek. That also makes me suspect that maybe his dad was a Greek. And Cyrene, where we saw on that map, is referenced 3 times in the New Testament, our New Testament. Mark's parents, Aristobulus, his father and his mother, Miriam, migrated to Palestine shortly after the birth of Mark, because the Berbers attacked them in their home and in their town and in their property, and they finally they just packed up and moved to Palestine, and they moved to Cana of Galilee. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Not far from Jerusalem, and this was a wealthy family. It said, I got this from other sources, it is said that Aristobulus was tied in very closely with the politicians, and he was a traitor, but I don't know whether that's true or not. That's interesting. Historically, as a young man, though, let's talk about John Mark. Church traditions state that Miriam, Mark's mother, was an admirer of Jesus and followed him everywhere, and that Mark was one of the attendants at the wedding of Cana, where Jesus turned the water into wine. Now, isn't that interesting? Mark is being presented by the history of this Coptic church as being very involved in what we're reading about in the New Testament. Another thing I notice is, seems like everyone is related to everyone else. But anyway, we'll move on from that. Alfred Edersheim, in his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, suggests that the last Passover meal was eaten at the home of Miriam. And the first reference that seems to have been Mark was the man who was, according to Jesus, told, look for this man carrying water and follow him, and ask for the master of the house. Well, the master of the house was Aristobulus. This was the house, supposedly, according to the Coptic history, was the house of John Mark's mother. Now, his father is still alive, and it seems to have been frequented by the disciples often after this. Mark would have been surrounded by Christian helpers, and the influence throughout his life would have been very great. John Mark, based on his events, recorded him as places as an eyewitness of Gethsemane. Now, let me explain. Peter cut off Malchus's ear, the ear of the high priest, and it's recorded by John Mark in his gospel. But Mark also records that a young man followed Jesus after that event, and even though the disciples had fled, they were gone. Peter is gone, but Mark records that a young man was wearing a linen cloth and fled naked. Now, how could he have known unless he was there? And the Coptic tradition says that was him. He was the eyewitness. The soldier grabbed his linen and he ran away naked, as recorded in John's gospel. Mark is related to Peter. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, think about this for a minute. Peter's wife is related to Aristobulus, and that makes Peter related to John Mark. And Mark knew Peter, he knew the apostles, and his cousin, Barnabas. Now, Barnabas was from Cyprus. Barnabas was a cousin of John Mark. All were great examples of prayer and answered prayer in Mark's presence. So it had a real influence on the young man's life. A few years later, Mark's father died, and there's a question as to how he died, but no information on that yet. And Peter took a real interest in John Mark, probably because he was related to him. He married to the relative of John Mark's mother. But anyway, he considered him a son, and actually in Peter's writing, with the church that is at Babel and that elected together with you salutes you, and so does Marcus, my son. And there's a lot been made there about Peter. Well, he's his son because he baptized him. It's his son in the faith. I don't know about that. It may actually be more than that. It may be that Peter actually semi-adopted John Mark during this time. And he saw to it that he had a good education. And Mark studied the law and the classics, and Mark was multilingual, which was really beneficial to the ministry of the first century. He was fluent in many languages of the day. Later, in 44 AD, Peter is in prison. And the events that happened there, you know what happened there, where the angel freed Peter from prison, and he goes to the house and he knocks on the door, and Rhoda recognizes his voice, and it's said that that house is Miriam's house. It's John Mark's mother's house, and that's where the people were praying. And that's one of the contentions of the Coptic church. And Barnabas was determined to take John Mark with him on his missionary journeys that he's recorded there in Acts 15, verse 37. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry and took with them John, whose surname was Mark, Acts 12, verse 25. So Mark is very involved in this early ministry. But you know what Mark is known for. He's known for leaving the ministry, leaving the missionary journey. And there is so much bad written about him. Without exception, every source that I found said that Mark deserted Paul and Barnabas on their mission. And they look at his heart and they say it was because of selfish reasons. Obviously, Paul was pretty perturbed at Mark. But anyway, what if, though, I'm not so sure of that. Perhaps Mark felt a calling to do something different. Maybe he was even approached by the Spirit of God to do something different. I don't know. I doubt that, because I think it should have been known. He would have said something and everybody would have been happy. But anyway, he had a different idea about what he should be doing, obviously. He was definitely playing second fiddle with what he was doing there. And think about how much he had to offer with his education and his language. He's bilingual. And he could have felt underutilized, perhaps. And I can relate to that. I've been in that predicament before. He returns to Jerusalem, where his mother was, and the next event in his life, as recorded by the Coptics, is this. 48 AD, Mark founded Christianity in Egypt, Alexandria. Now, doesn't that explain why perhaps I think maybe there was more to Mark leaving than just sort of a selfish reason? Alexandria had the largest Jewish population outside of Israel, and Philo, a Jewish philosopher, claimed that there was about 1 million Jews in Egypt, and most of them were in Alexandria. So that's a lot of the fields truly are white to harvest there. And Philo continued his report, and he said that the church planted in Alexandria mimicked the Jerusalem church. It was admirable in doctrine. That's what he said, what Philo said, mimicking Acts 2:42. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and in prayer. And Mark was very involved in that, because Mark, the Coptics said, Mark instructed in the Hebrew scriptures and the epistle of James, and he was very, very involved in that church. Now, side note, Apollos, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 18, was from Alexandria. Wouldn't it be a good question to ask? I wonder if he knew Mark. I don't know. But anyway, 49 AD, moving forward, Barnabas again wants to take Mark on the next missionary trip, but this leads to quite a squabble between Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas ends up going a separate way, and they go to Cyprus. Now, one thing I didn't realize until I researched this, Barnabas' home is Cyprus. That's where he's from. And from this point on, Barnabas disappears out of the New Testament. We don't see any more from him. 55 to 60 AD, there's a lot of questions surrounding Mark at this time, but how did he reconcile with Paul is one of the big ones. Mark wrote the first gospel based on what he heard from Peter, and what he saw from Peter as well. And he was in Cyprus around the family. He may have gone to Jerusalem, or he could have just written the gospel there while he was in Cyprus, or Mark may have written the gospel while he was in Rome. I don't think anyone really knows for sure. He was a learned man, and he certainly was qualified to bring the life of Jesus through the teachings of Peter to life from memory. And Peter was family. In 60 AD, in the span of 11 years, Paul's had a change of heart regarding Mark. And we find Mark helping Paul in Rome. Paul was under house arrest with only one Roman guard watching him, but He was under house arrest. He was restricted. And in 62 AD, Paul writes the book of Colossians and asks the church there to welcome Mark, indicating Mark begins traveling again. He writes Philemon and says, Mark is a co-laborer. 63 AD, Mark is said to be with Peter in Babylon, ministering to the scattered Jews. According to the Coptic Church, Babylon is Babylon. Now that's interesting, isn't it? We can make it say what we want it to say, but they say Peter was in Babylon, and that's where Mark was. In 64 AD, there's evidence that Mark was back in Alexandria, where he planted this church originally, 16 years earlier. And most likely it was this time period when Mark became bishop over the Church of Alexandria. Even though the Coptic Church doesn't call him bishop, they call him the Apostle Mark. In 68 AD, Mark was tied to a horse, dragged for 2 days through the streets of Alexandria and in the district of Gocalia by the pagans Serapis and the Greek-Egyptian god, Serapis, the Greek-Egyptian god. The Coptic Church celebrates his martyrdom on the 8th of May each year. I put that on my calendar to remind me, just so maybe I can celebrate that as well. Later, Mark's head is kept in a church that's named after him in Alexandria, and other parts of him were in St. Mark's Cairo Cathedral. The remaining parts of his body are in the San Marco Cathedral in Venice, Italy. His titles, the evangelist, the apostle, the witness, and the martyr. But I'm calling him the amazing one. I hope you got a blessing out of understanding John Mark a little bit. He wasn't just a silly little boy that ran off. He was a man who preached the gospel for Jesus Christ. God bless you as